Hi, everybody. It's Eric Murray from the SugarHuddle.com. Well, we've come down to the final division. Going to finish off here with the AFC South before we finish off all of our previews for the 2018 NFL season. And look for very soon, tomorrow night maybe, I'm going to try to get up the playoff predictions, which will include the Super Bowl prediction for next season, for this upcoming season. So look for that very, very soon. But first, we got to talk about the AFC South. The AFC South has been a very, very interesting division for a lot of years because it's been a division where it seems like it's either one team that dominates or it's a wide open division where you don't really have to win a huge amount of games to take the division. More often than not, it's one team that kind of dominates. But at any rate, it's kind of more and more wide open this year. It feels like I look at Tennessee, I look at Jacksonville, I look at Houston, I say there's not really much that separates the three of them. And even Indianapolis, with Andrew Luck back, it's going to be interesting to see what happens there and see how good they can be, but they've got a lot of holes, so we'll see how that goes. But anyways, going down the line, I've decided that I think the Tennessee Titans are going to win the AFC South, and they're going to be 10-6 to do it. Last year, they really gained a whole heck of a lot of confidence because they had that big comeback victory in Kansas City down 21-3. They won 22-21 in that wild card playoff game, and they played the Patriots fairly tough in the divisional playoffs for the first quarter and a half, and then it kind of fell apart. But the big news is they're really trying to start a revolution this year. You know, the city of Nashville is kind of starting a little bit of a social revolution in terms of a lot of like northern millennials are kind of moving down there. It's the hip, trendy city that everybody kind of wants to live in. I wouldn't mind living in Nashville either if I had the opportunity. But anyways, you look at their football team plays down there at Nissan Stadium, the Tennessee Titans. Tennessee, they decided to move on from their head coach, Mike Mularkey. He played that, what he liked to call the exotic smash mouth, which was a ground and pound offense. It was a power run offense. You tried to mix in kind of some fancy pass elements as well, and that's why it was called the exotic smash mouth. But nonetheless, it was a run-first offense. Marcus Mariota, their franchise quarterback, who of course was the number 2 overall pick back in 2015, the former Heisman winner out of Oregon, he struggled last year, 13 touchdowns, 15 interceptions. And so, you know, the big news this offseason is Mike Vrabel, the former New England Patriot and Pittsburgh Steeler linebacker, won some Super Bowls in New England. Then he became an assistant coach under Bill Belichick. And then, of course, he was a defensive coordinator in Houston last year, and it really didn't have a stacked deck because all his top players were all injured. So they had a rough year, but he still got the head coaching job in Tennessee. And a lot of people look at him and say, oh, he's just going to be like an old school, typical defensive-minded head coach. He could be conservative, run the ball, play great defense, blah, blah, blah. What does he do? He goes out and he gets Matt LaFleur, the former offensive coordinator for the Los Angeles Rams last year, who worked under Sean McVay, also has worked with Kyle Shanahan. He worked in Washington and he worked in Atlanta with those guys. Matt LaFleur is a guy that, like Shanahan, like Sean McVay, you know, he's going to run kind of similar elements of what they like to do. We know with Kyle Shanahan, like his dad, Mike Shanahan, you know, you're going to have some zone blocking schemes, and then, of course, you're going to also eventually mix in some RPOs and things like that. And so that's kind of what they're trying to do in Tennessee, is they're trying to have this revolutionary offense, really try to help out Marcus Mariota and company, because they want to have an offense kind of similar to what Mariota had in college to make him as successful as possible, really get his numbers up. I mean, there's no reason that he should have had the numbers he had last year. Part of that was on him. Part of that, too, was just the way the offense is set up. Had some receiver issues for a long, long time. So they're trying to make more of a revolutionary type offense. A lot of what Shanahan and what McVay like to do, and especially last year, you know, they have like what they like to call 21 offense, where you have the 2 tight ends, 1 running back, always have the 2 wide receivers. Last year, apparently, it was more of an 11 offense, they called it, and I believe that was where they had actually 1 tight end and 2 running backs, if I'm not mistaken. I might be wrong on that. I have to go back and look that up. But at any rate, essentially what this offense tries to do is it tries to expose the defense with a lot of pre-snap reads. And it's a lot of window dressing because they'll line up in a lot of different formations, and they'll run a lot of the same plays out of different formations. It's kind of like what Steve Spurrier used to do with the fun and gun at Florida. So it's a little bit similar to that, but more of a pro-style type approach. But nonetheless, you know, Matt LaFleur comes in, and he's trying to bring in this revolutionary offense. Mike Vrabel doesn't care that he's a defensive-minded guy at heart, because he knows that in today's NFL, it's a league that completely favors the offense. A lot of penalties going against the defense. We see this new ridiculous helmet rule, how that could affect things. So Mike Vrabel knows he needs a revolutionary offense, a revolutionary offensive coordinator. And LaFleur, he could be the next young head coach in line, ready to take over a team after McVay and after Shanahan. Both those guys are off to pretty darn good starts where they're at, and a lot of promise for them this year. So Matt LaFleur is a guy, he's very open. He doesn't have an ego from what I've heard. He's a guy who really is going to not just stick to his same exact offense in the sense that he's going to look at his personnel and say, okay, if I need to make these adjustments, if I need to run these type of plays, these type of formations, I'm going to adjust my personnel. I'm open for suggestions. So he's a guy who's just a very, very modern day kind of revolutionary type head coach, or revolutionary type offense coordinator, I should say. This is the first time he's really fully calling plays, because even last year Sean McVay was more of the play caller, so that's going to be a little bit of a challenge. But nonetheless, a lot of promise there, a lot of hype there. And you look at the offense he's got, other than Mariota, you think about Derrick Henry, he's a guy, his first couple years, his numbers have gone up. He's shown a nice improvement. Not a real big pass catcher, though, when you think about Todd Gurley, the Rams, and some of these other running backs that Matt LaFleur has worked with, when you think of Devontae Freeman in Atlanta, and even Tevin Coleman. So not having that number one back that is a pass catcher is going to be a little bit of a challenge. That will be a little bit of an adjustment. But Derrick Henry has gotten a lot better from year one to year two, and now with DeMarco Murray gone, he's going to be the number one guy. He's going to be the bell cow back. So that's going to be really, really big for this offense. Remember, another big news thing for the Titans this offseason is the acquisition of Dion Lewis, the former New England Patriot. Dion Lewis, he's a speedster. He's a guy who's missed a lot of games in the past. He's a tremendous return man, catches a good number of passes out of the backfield, has a good yard per carry average, had his best year last year offensively, and he also played all 16. Did a great job for the Patriots, and the Titans were able to scoop him up for a very reasonable deal. So that's going to be a real thunder and lightning type of tandem there, and having a Dion Lewis who can do some of those things that a Todd Gurley can do, but obviously not nearly to the same extent because he's way smaller and he's not an every down guy by any means. But combining those two guys' talents, maybe they can make one guy that can be a little bit Todd Gurley-like. We'll see, but that's a really strong backfield tandem. And the thing about it is they've got a really strong offensive line. They've had all these guys who have really barely missed any games. I mean, they've got guys like Josh Klein, Quentin Spain. Of course, they've got the tackles like Taylor Lewan, Jack Conklin. They've also got Ben Jones. So all these guys have pretty much played all 16 games the last couple of years. I mean, these are guys that stay healthy. Everything stays intact. One concern, of course, Jack Conklin got injured during that Patriots divisional playoff game, and it looks like he's just getting back now and getting ready and should be ready for week one. But you've got a real strong offensive line, so you got to feel good if you're Mariota. You've got what looks like a running game that's just only going to get better and better. Now you have Dion Lewis, who's a threat out of the backfield as a pass catcher, so that's really good. You still got Delaney Walker as a tight end. You've got Jonnu Smith, who's really like a mini Delaney Walker he's actually slightly taller, but just mini in terms that he's a younger Delaney Walker. And he's a guy who really showed a lot of promise last year, and he's only going to get better now that he's in more of a favorable tight end offense and more of a advanced offense, something that's a little bit more 21st century. So you look at Walker, who's been just tremendous. He's really been their best receiver the last several years because they haven't had real great actual wide receivers. You look at Jonnu Smith. That's a pretty promising foundation. Now, receiver-wise, Tennessee for many years, even back to when they first moved to Tennessee in the mid to late 90s and then eventually changed their name to the Titans in 99 when they went to the Super Bowl, they really haven't had a ton of success, a ton of luck with their receiving corps, really haven't had a true number one guy most years. But this is looking like the most promising year that their receivers have had in a long time. Now, Rashard Matthews, he's going to play more out of the slot this year. You're going to have Tajay Sharp, the former UMass product, missed all of last year. He's coming back now. He had a lot of hype surrounding him a couple years ago when he got drafted. He's been looking good in camp. And then Corey Davis, who was a top 10 pick last year by the Titans, didn't do a whole lot last year. There's hope that this year he'll turn it up and he'll have a better year and he'll be healthy. We'll see how that goes. And, of course, Tywan Taylor, a former Western Kentucky product. I believe this is now his second year in the NFL. He's a guy who's really shown a lot of promise this preseason, especially last year. He had a big touchdown. So or I'm sorry, especially in the preseason, he had a big touchdown. I believe it was an 80-yarder. I think it was against the Buccaneers. I believe it might have been the second week of the preseason, the first or second week. But nonetheless, they feel pretty darn good about him. He can be really a game breaker in this offense. Right now, Sharps could actually start ahead of him. Then you're going to have Corey Davis on the other side, and again, with Matthews in the slot. But right now, Corey Davis and Mariota haven't really been able to hook up much in the preseason. They've had trouble kind of finding the ball with each other. So that's something that is going to be a concern. I know going into this week where none of the starters played, I think they hadn't even connected on a single pass. I think Davis had only been targeted something like 3 times or something like that, 3 or 6 times from Mariota, and they couldn't complete a single pass. So that is a concern because Davis is a guy who could be not just legit number 1 receiver, but one of the better receivers in the NFL down the line. And Sharp could be a really good receiver. Taylor could be a really big weapon. Rashard Matthews has been a very solid player in recent years. So this receiving core, all of a sudden, they go from being a mediocre to bottom feeder type receiving core for years and years and years to now where they could be a top 10 type receiving core and an overall supporting cast, a top 10 type supporting cast in this league. So I really, really like what they're doing offensively. One concern I have defensively, they got some good talent on defense, but they've got a lot of injured linebackers. You know, obviously, Dean Pease is now taking over as defensive coordinator. He's taking over for the great Dick LeBeau. And Dean Pease, he's a guy who was a Super Bowl champion with the Baltimore Ravens in 2012. Another guy that runs a 3-4 zone blitz type defense. So not a whole lot's going to change. Terminology will change a little bit, but schematically, a lot of things will stay the same. But they've got a lot of injured linebackers. You know, Derek Morgan, this is, I believe, his 8th or 9th year in the league. He's never been a big sack guy, and he's been banged up in camp. Brian Arakpo, who used to be known as Brian Osakpo, he's been in Tennessee for a little while now. He's been banged up. Harold Landry, who was one of their draft picks, defensive end out of Boston College, I believe they took him in the 2nd round. He's been banged up. They traded for a guy that Dean Pease worked with in Baltimore, Kamale Correa, who's been in the league for a couple of years now, who hasn't really done anything. I think he has 18 career tackles, 0 sacks. But the fact that he has that relationship with Pease and the fact that he's worked with him, that does go a long way, so perhaps something could come out of that. But nonetheless, definitely a concern there because you have got all these banged up linebackers. And then, of course, their 1st-round pick, inside linebacker, Rashaan Evans from Alabama, another guy who would miss a good portion of training camp, and there's concerns how healthy is he going to be going into the season. So overall, there's a lot of concern there at linebacker, and that is something to be concerned about because they do have some pretty challenging games early on in the season. It's not going to be the easiest schedule in the world by any means. So that is a concern, but overall, you know, you've got Kevin Byard in that secondary, got Logan Ryan. The big news, of course, Malcolm Butler reuniting with Logan Ryan. I'm going to say this right now. I think Malcolm Butler is going to be as motivated as any player in the National Football League period this year. He really wants to prove himself, especially after that whole debacle in the Super Bowl where he got benched before the start of the game, even though he had played more snaps than any Patriot defender last year. He's really a man on the mission. The fact that he gets to reunite with Logan Ryan, and then, of course, you've got that All-Pro and Kevin Byard, who led the league in interceptions last year, and the secondary and at safety. They've got a strong secondary, got some good-looking defensive linemen. Obviously, Jarrell Casey's been a Pro Bowler. Daquan Jones is a player that's on the rise that a lot of people feel good about. So they've got a really, really good – and then, of course, Benny Logan at nose tackle, big upgrade from Sylvester Williams. Logan's done a nice job in recent years in Kansas City and Philly, much more productive than Sylvester Williams ever was. Nonetheless, though, those hurt linebackers are going to be a setback, and we'll see kind of how it transpires throughout the season. Definitely want to get some of those sack numbers up as well. But overall, they've got a really, really strong defense, pretty good depth. But again, the linebacker depth is going to be a concern because of those injuries, because of that health. But the offensive line, if Conklin's able to bounce back, all their offensive linemen stay healthy, got good-looking running backs, good-looking receivers and tight ends. And I think Mariota, working with Matt LaFleur, this is going to be a big breakout year for him, just like we saw with Jared Goff working with LaFleur. And, of course, Sean McVay last year with the Rams. They won the division, and Goff ended up being a Pro Bowler, big improvement after a really, really bad rookie year. So I like the Titans to go 10-6, win the division. They're obviously going to try to win at least one more playoff game again this year. And they're going to have a shot at doing that. They're going to be a team that's going to make some noise in the postseason. But nonetheless, I think they're going to win the division. It's going to be very, very wide open, very, very tight division. I've got 2 teams at 9-7 that are going to finish 2nd and 3rd in the division. One's going to win the tiebreaker over the other to get the final wild card and make the playoffs. over the other team. That's going to be the Houston Texans. They're going to finish second in division. They're going to edge out the Jaguars, who are going to finish third. Jaguars 11-5, won the division a year ago. So, went to the AFC Championship game, almost won that in New England. Of course, a lot of hype and a lot of promise that perhaps they could maybe make a Super Bowl run this year. I'll get to them in a moment, but I want to talk about the Texans first. The big news, of course, is going to be Deshaun Watson. 19 touchdowns, 9 interceptions in 7 games. Started his last 6, was 3-3. Really should have been more like 5-1. The defense, all those injuries really let him down. Had to play some shootouts there. But, of course, Deshaun Watson, that non-contact torn ACL midseason last year. Remember, he had torn an ACL in the other knee in college. So there's concern, is it going to be like an RG3 situation where he's a dual-threat quarterback, has a great rookie year, and then all of a sudden he can't bounce back from injury and the league kind of figures him out. He's kind of had a mediocre preseason as far as his numbers, very, very hit or miss. Nothing to really write home about. But I think he's much more advanced than RG3 or even Lamar Jackson, for that matter, ever were coming out of college. And he's got a lot of promise. He's a clutch, late-game guy, ice water in his veins type of quarterback, which is what you want your franchise quarterback, top-flight quarterback to be. I wouldn't really buy into him, just kind of throw out fantasy football for a minute. I wouldn't really buy into him as far as a fantasy standpoint because I think probably touchdown pass-wise, probably 24-28. I think some people are thinking he's going to go well over 30. I just can't buy into that because they don't have a real great receiving core right now. And the fact of the matter is him bouncing back from injury, Carson Wentz, Ryan Tannehill, all these quarterbacks bouncing back from a torn ACL. That first year back after you tear your ACL, you usually struggle a little bit. Tom Brady did pretty good his first year back in 2009, but he still was a little bit up and down. They didn't make a Super Bowl run. Carson Palmer, when he came back for Cincinnati, he was a little bit skittish. He's a tough quarterback, but you could tell it was kind of in his head a little bit about getting hit again that next year. That would have been 2006, I think. So at the end of the day, that is the thing concerned with Deshaun Watson, and he's a guy that he's probably going to have to run around a lot because they've got a really, really bad offensive line right now. They started 5 different left tackles last year. Now, Dwayne Brown, of course, had that holdout in training camp. He only played 1 game for him. They traded him. His debut last year, or his debut with his new team last year was actually against the Texans. It was with the Seahawks, and the Seahawks won that game in a shootout, so maybe the Texans should have waited a little bit longer to trade him if they could have controlled it. And Brown actually now got a contract extension this offseason for what's generally been a bad Seahawk line. But they could use him right now. They've got Julian Davenport, the former Bucknell product. He's a guy who had some starts at right tackle and left tackle last year. Very, very mixed bag, very, very hit or miss. Overall, he's a guy that is still an interesting prospect, and we'll see kind of what happens with him. But they've had some injuries on the offensive line. They've kind of had a musical chairs, and it's just one of those things that it's hard to feel real good about that offensive line because it just kind of feels like Deshaun's going to be running for his life all year long. So what that means is Deshaun's going to have to run more than he should. That means he puts himself more at risk of tearing yet another ACL because he's going to carry the ball more upfield, not just going to be scrambling around. Or it's going to lead to way more incompletions. His completion percentage was like 61.8 or something like that last year. And so now you're talking about a guy who might barely complete 60% because he has to keep throwing incompletions just to avoid getting sacks. And he got sacked a lot of times in 7 games. I think he got sacked like 19 times. Texans gave up, I want to say something like 54 sacks or something crazy like that. But you look at your offensive line. I mean, you've got Fulton, you've got Martin, and they've both got contract extent, or they got new contracts to come over with the Texans. But overall, not a real great offensive line. Chantrell Henderson, who's had a couple suspensions in Buffalo, he's projected as a right tackle. Jeff, you got Allen at right guard. Not a real great offensive line, and so. Remember, this is a team that didn't run the ball particularly well last year. Lamar Miller didn't have a real great year. He had like 888 yards, but he only averaged, I think, like 3.8 yards a carry. Sorry about this camera trying to adjust this properly. But, only had like 3.8 yards a carry. Alfred Blue was a non-factor, didn't play much. Deontay Foreman, he's going to start off the season, I believe, on suspension for 4 games. He actually got 2 more carries than Blue. So they've got really, really talented running backs, and they've got some promise there. But again, if you got no holes, you've got no running lane, and obviously that's going to be the interesting thing with Deshaun Watson because this is a team that had all these 30-plus point games. They tore it up offensively, and they could show that they could beat anybody with Watson, even with that offensive line. And then without him, they were horrible. So it's going to be interesting to see with Watson back, is it could be the same magic as last year where they can have all these high-scoring games where they can win shootouts, so kind of like the Raiders from a couple years ago when Derek Carr had that great year and the Raiders had absolutely no defense. So Deshaun Watson might have a lot of fourth-quarter comebacks this year if they're going to win games. But at any rate, that offensive line just not looking good. Running game is going to probably be hampered because of that line. As far as receivers, DeAndre Hopkins is arguably the best receiver in the NFL. I mean, there's like 4 or 5 guys you can certainly make that case for, and he's definitely one of those guys. But think about it, I mean, he's had some really, really terrible quarterback play in Houston these last 4 years, or actually he's played 5 years now. This will be his 6th year, but really, really terrible quarterback play. Tom Savage, who not a Houston Texan anymore. Brock Osweiler, they gave all that money to, which was a stupid investment. Brian Hoyer, who was a short-term guy, got him to the playoffs, but he's just a backup quarterback. So then you get Deshaun Watson, and it's definitely a big, big boost, but then you lose him for the second half of last year, and yet Hopkins still had a really productive year. He's had a bunch of productive years. He's been a 90 to 100 catch guy, well over 1,000 yards, usually 7-8 touchdowns a year, something like that. He's a heck of a receiver, but the problem is you look at the rest of the receiving core. William Fuller's a guy. He's a speedster that doesn't really stay healthy. He's had some nagging injuries in his career. They just cut Braxton Miller, who's been a really, really underwhelming player for them. So you can't feel real great about their receiving core right now. I'm trying to look at some of these other guys just so I don't miss out on anybody here. Yeah, I want to talk about the tight ends too. They had their tight ends were last in the NFL with just 53% of their targets caught. So of all the times they were targeted last year, they only caught 53% of their targets. They've had primarily blocking tight ends in recent years, and a guy like Ryan Griffin, who's a projected start, he's been a nice player. He was a nice player at UConn. Been a nice player as primarily a blocking tight end with Texans. Caught 50 passes a couple years ago, but I think he only played like 7 games last year. Had some injuries and didn't catch a whole lot of passes. They had C.J. Federwicks in the past, and he, of course, retired this offseason. Had some other guys as well. They go out and they draft Jordan Akins and Jordan Thomas in the draft. And Jordan Akins, a guy at UCF, was a pretty productive player at UCF. 6'3", 250, good athlete. He's also learning to block. So when you have tight ends that were last in the league with touchdown receptions, I think they only had 2 combined, didn't have a whole lot of catches, low catch percentage on the targets. You're basically just talking about blocking tight ends. And when you have the offensive line issues you have and you're not able to run the ball, I get that, but you still need to have a dynamic pass catcher at tight end. And having a guy like Jordan Akins out of UCF, I believe he went in the 3rd round, that could be big for them. So Jordan Akins is a rookie that I would kind of keep an eye on because he's somebody that could really develop a great relationship with Deshaun Watson. And don't be shocked if he's somebody that could even be a little bit of a surprise player in fantasy, maybe not all year long, but somebody you could pick up along the way. So kind of keep an eye on him. And then Jordan Thomas, he's more of a developmental player, more of a blocking type tight end, but he's a guy who could definitely replace Federwicks. So overall, their tight end situation looks like it's much improved, especially if Akins can catch some passes. But overall, I still have some concerns if I'm Deshaun Watson. How much better is the running game going to be if I'm playing all 16? How much better is this offensive line going to be than last year? Because right now it doesn't look too promising. And the receiving core, how deep is it really? I mean, you can't just always target DeAndre Hopkins. So it's going to be interesting. But the main reason, even without Deshaun Watson, even having terrible quarterback play without him and losing all those games down the stretch with Tom Savage and company as their quarterbacks. Remember, this is a defense that's been a number 1 ranked or top 5 ranked defense for the last number of years. They end up last in scoring. They gave up over 27 points a game, and that's even worse than the Browns, who were 0-16. J.J. Watt, he's only played 8 games the last couple of years. Whitney Merciless went down early last year, only played I think 4, 5, 7 games, somewhere around there. Lost all these great players, and so it really hampered them because their sack production went way down. I want to say it was somewhere down around 32 or 35, somewhere in that range. And they're usually a team that has 45, 50-plus sacks and usually amongst the league leaders. So when you lose Watt, who's not going to give you a whole lot of production when he's only playing a handful of games, and the same with Merciless. That's 2 big guys right there. And Jadeveon Clowney has really kind of taken the role as their top defensive player the last couple of years, former number 1 overall pick in 2014, back-to-back Pro Bowls. been a really, really good pass rusher and balanced player, but he doesn't put up big sack numbers. So he gets a good pass rush, but he doesn't put up the big sack numbers. I think 2 years ago he had like 6. I think last year he had something like 9 or 9.5. So he's not going to give you the real big numbers. So you need more there. And again, if J.J. Watt can't stay healthy again, Whitney Merciless, if he can't stay healthy again, that's really going to plague them. And their defense possibly is going to be a lower-ranked defense once again. Remember, this is going to be the third year in a row they're going to have a different defensive coordinator. Mike Vrabel, like I already mentioned, he became the Titans head coach, so they got another defensive coordinator in there in Houston. But you look at the defense, they have DJ Reader as their nose tackle. A little bit of issue, though, with their defensive ends, because when Watt was hurt, they had a couple guys I think his name's Joel Heath, and then they had Carlos Watkins, who they weren't particularly productive when they came in and they played defensive end last year. Don't have a whole lot of depth right now. Christian Covington didn't play a whole lot of games last year. I think he only played 10, and he was a little bit banged up. So defense line depth isn't real great. Have a lot of issues as far as your pass rush, because you just don't know how many games you're going to get out of Watt. If you can get 16 out of Watt, I guarantee you Watt's going to have 12-plus sacks and have a great year. He had 76 sacks in his first 5 years, over 15 a year on average. But again, at this point, a lot of people are really doubting how much is he going to give you. And then Whitney Merciless, the guy that usually doesn't miss a whole lot of time, he should be back, but what kind of year is he going to have? Linebacker-wise, you still got Bernardrick McKinney and Zach Cunningham. Zach Cunningham, who wasn't really expected to start as a rookie, stepped up, the former Vanderbilt product. I think he was a second or third round pick in 2017. Really had a nice year. McKinney led the team in tackles, I believe, and he actually got a 5-year, $50 million extension in the offseason. But another position where they really don't have a whole lot of depth right now. They've got a couple of younger guys, but neither guy is really kind of blowing the roof off the place. And then as far as outside linebackers, beyond Merciless, they've got Brendan Scarlett, Duke Ejiofor, who was the former Wake Forest product, who a lot of people thought would originally be like a second or third round player. Very productive his last 2 years at Wake. I think he had like 18.5 sacks the last 2 years. He ended up being a sixth rounder, kind of an inconsistent player, but nonetheless, he's a guy who could add some depth there. But at any rate, it's still one of those deals where still going to be a lot of uncertainty in the defense. And again, Watt's not there. Merciless isn't completely available all year long. They're going to have some struggles in the front seven, and that's going to be a setback, especially trying to win this division. Secondary-wise, you're making some moves there. Of course, Andre Hall, he's injured. He's got cancer right now, and so there's uncertainty there. They drafted Justin Reed, the third rounder out of Stanford. Really good-looking player. Probably has a versatility to play either safety spot. He's going to have a good chance to possibly start. Of course, Kareem Jackson, their longtime corner, they moved him to strong safety. He was projected recently to be the starter, but again, Reed could take that spot. So there's kind of a musical chairs there. Obviously, the big news is they went out and they got Tyrann Mathieu, the former Arizona Cardinal. Mathieu was a really, really good player in Arizona. He's a guy that did have some durability issues, even though he didn't miss hardly any games. Really, really good player. Not the greatest in pass coverage, but a really good all-around safety. Definitely is going to bolster the secondary quite a bit. But, Jonathan Joseph hasn't been that productive the last couple of years, really getting up there in age. I believe he's like 34-ish now, somewhere around there, 34, 35. So defensively, it's going to be kind of spotty. It's going to be hit and miss. And so Deshaun Watson and company, they might be involved in some shootouts. And it'll be interesting to see Deshaun, how much he bounces back from that injury. So because of that, I would say that Houston's going to finish second in the division narrowly to the Titans. But I got them going 9-7, and I still think they can make a ton of noise in the playoffs. But getting there is going to be a little bit of a challenge, especially when they have to try to edge out Jacksonville. And speaking about the Jacksonville Jaguars, with them, they've got a healthy quarterback, but not a particularly good quarterback. When I did my article on the Jaguars, when I did my preview, I started out by saying, Blake Bortles, so you want to be an NFL quarterback, go out and prove it, kid, because Blake Bortles is a guy, third overall pick in 2014. This guy I really liked out of UCF. I mean, he's a guy that a lot of people thought could be maybe like that next Ben Roethlisberger, 6'5", 235, really, really good athlete, actually a much better athlete than Roethlisberger for that matter. But he's a guy who's been wildly inconsistent. 3 years in his NFL career, he had more pick sixes than wins. He had 11 pick sixes and I think just 10 career wins at that point. Now, Jacksonville is a terrible team in his first few years in the league, of course, so that you have to give him a little bit of a pass there. But the fact of the matter is, he's a guy that 1 week he can go out and he can just blow you away. He can throw 3 or 4 touchdown passes, have a 300-yard game, and look like an amazing quarterback. Next week he comes out and he throws 3 interceptions and has like a 60 quarterback rating or 60 passer rating. Completes 50% of his passes. Really terrible game. Kind of like almost like a Jay Cutler type of situation going on, but without the durability concerns and a little bit of a better athlete. So Blake Bortles is a guy that he had like a stretch 3 weeks in a row. I believe it was weeks 13 through 15, where he had a rating of like 120 plus every week. He had 8 touchdowns, no interceptions. They had a few key wins. They beat the Seahawks, and there were some Seahawks players that really kind of doubted him and the fact that he beat them. That was a nice win. And then the last couple of weeks of the season really laid an egg. He had a number of games where his passer rating was like 63.8 or worse. And then he had a number of games where his passer rating was well over 100. So it kind of balanced out somewhere in between, and his rating ended up being, I want to say it was somewhere in that 84 to 86 range. And I think his career rating is just over 80, which isn't really anything to write home about. Just barely completed 60% of his passes last year. For his career, I think he's only completing maybe 58 or 58 and a half, somewhere in that range, close to 60. Not a very good number either way. So just another year where you look at it and you say, okay, well, what are we going to get out of Blake Bortles? Obviously Jacksonville, they had a chance to give Bortles that 5th-year option on his rookie deal, but instead they decided to give him a 3-year extension. Now, $54 million with just $26 million guaranteed, not the craziest investment in the world when you consider it's your starting quarterback, but nonetheless, a lot of people don't feel super confident in the Jaguars because, again, it feels like the defense and the running game are going to have to carry them if they want to not just get back to the playoffs, but get back to the AFC title game, maybe even win a Super Bowl. Blake Bortles is going to have to do something, and who knows if he can get it done in those big moments. The wild card game when they hosted the Buffalo Bills, sadly, he outplayed Tyrod Taylor, but he himself had a terrible game. He had 87 passing yards, actually had 88 rushing yards, though, and that was a big difference for them in the 10-3 win. Did enough against Pittsburgh. Wasn't really a great performance on his part, but it was a shootout, and he did just enough, made enough plays down the stretch, had a nice touchdown pass there in the fourth quarter to Tommy Bohannon, the fullback. And then New England game, he was playing the game of his life for 3 quarters. Then all of a sudden, fourth quarter, couldn't really make that big completion, couldn't put together that one last drive to get any points on the board at all. A lot of that was on Doug Marrone, who got really conservative from the final minute of the first half, I think 55 seconds left, through the end of the game, too conservative. So obviously that's going to have to change as well. Marrone's a pretty good coach, but again, you know what you have in your quarterback. You can't get overly conservative, or else you're not going to be able to consistently repeat that success you had last year when you went 11-5. So that's why I think Jacksonville is going to be 9-7, and they're going to lose out on the tiebreaker to the Titans, and they're going to finish 3rd in the division. Now, there's a lot to love about Jacksonville, even when you get beyond the quarterback issues and some of the issues on offense, which I'll get back to in a moment. Defensively, they have amazing defense. Saxonville, as they call them, 55 sacks, just one shy of the Steelers for the league last year. They had all these guys that were going to Pro Bowls. Just an amazing defensive line that got that much stronger when they drafted Taven Bryan, the former Florida Gator, in the first round this year. And he's a guy, college defensive tackle, that's probably going to be a defensive end behind Calais Campbell. Calais Campbell, up there in his mid-30s, but he had the year of his life last year. I believe he ended up with like 14 or 14 and a half sacks. Great year for him. You have Dante Fowler that has had some injury issues his first few years in the league, but he still had something like, I think, 8 sacks off the bench. Then, of course, you think about Malik Jackson. He's a guy that was on the Super Bowl champion Denver Broncos, made his first Pro Bowl last year as a defensive tackle. He also had a very impressive year. I think he had 8 or 9 sacks, something like 40-plus tackles. Really impressive year. And then their other defensive end who I struggle to pronounce his name, so I'm going to try to pronounce it correctly here. Yannick Ngakoue, I believe is how he pronounces it. He had a career year as well. He, too, made the Pro Bowl. I believe he had like 12 sacks. So they had all these guys with all these sacks, and the most amazing part is all these guys were playing like all 16 games. Really blew my mind. So you had all these guys that were playing all 16 games. You trade for Marcel Darius midseason, and he's a guy that supposedly has really been tearing up in camp. Looks like he's getting back to his old Pro Bowl form. So if you have him, you've got Taven Bryan, you got all these guys, your defense line is going to be absolutely unstoppable. So it's like one of those thoughts and prayers situations for the opposing offenses because, what the heck are you going to do? Linebacker, though, just as strong. You think about Telvin Smith. You think about Miles Jack. They've got some really, really good-looking linebackers. Those two guys are kind of like old school in their approach as far as, being tough as nails and not taking anybody's crap, but at the same time, they got that speed and that athleticism to go sideline to sideline and make some big things happen. And in the secondary, Jalen Ramsey, the great cornerback, who's obviously been talking trash on most NFL quarterbacks this offseason, which will be an interesting storyline to follow. But you've got him. Barry Church, after a lot of decent years in Dallas, had a real career year last year with the Jaguars. And then, of course, Brandon Carr had a real resurgence. Or I'm sorry, I apologize. I was thinking he's in Baltimore. Deshaun Gibson and A.J. Boye, I should say. Disregard that Carr part. But, A.J. Boye, he had a really good year. I believe he had 4 interceptions. Deshaun Gibson and Barry Church both had 4 interceptions, I believe. Ramsey, I think, also had 4. So they had like 4 interceptions across the board. Really, really nice job last year for all of those guys. And just a strong secondary. So defense top to bottom is just a really, really strong unit. A very, very unstoppable defense. And I think fantasy football, they're considered number 1 defense. They're definitely going to be a top 5, if not top 3 type defense this year. But at the same time, the thing is, just about all those guys, like I was saying, pretty much all played all 16 games last year. And, the NFL law of averages, it says that there's no way that all your starters are going to play just about every game year in and year out. So it seems almost like, I hate to say it, but you almost wonder, are some of these starters going to drop like flies this year? And they've got pretty good depth in Jacksonville, so it won't be the end of the world. But nonetheless, you want those guys around. You want those guys available. And so I'm wondering, are there going to be some injuries this year, which that'll be kind of an intriguing storyline. Offensively, they've got a good-looking offensive line. They've got some talent there. But then you look at their tight end, their receiver situation, not a whole lot of depth at tight end right now. You look at receiver, Marquise Lee, he was really just a number 2 type receiver. And then, of course, now he had to become the number 1 receiver this offseason, and he goes down with the knee injury in preseason against the Falcons a couple weeks ago. And again, not really a true number 1 receiver, so they're really kind of looking for somebody to step up. Allen Robinson, of course, left for Chicago, so that's why Marquise Lee basically became the de facto number 1. So that really put Jacksonville in a hole to begin with. We've got some really, really good-looking young players. You've got Keelan Cole. You've got Dede Westbrook. They were both rookies last year. Cole's undrafted out of Kentucky Wesleyan. Averaged 17.8 yards a catch on 42 catches. I believe that's like 748 yards. Dede Cole only played 7 games because of injuries after a great training camp last year, but he still had 27 catches. So they have some talent there. Dante Moncrief, who was a guy I really liked coming out of college, coming out of Ole Miss, drafted in the 3rd round 2014 by the Colts, but he's a guy who was just kind of an average number 3 type receiver in his time in Indianapolis, but he's now going to have to act as basically their number 1 because beyond that, you have the 2 second-year guys. And then, of course, you have a rookie in DJ Chark, the second rounder out of LSU, 6'3", 199, 4'4" in the 40. Just a really amazing athlete, really tore up in the Senior Bowl this past, I believe that was January. But again, is Chark ready as a rookie to take on that number 1 role, or is he more comfortable as a number 2 type guy? So that's forcing Moncrief, who's really never been more than a number 3 type guy and hasn't been very productive. I think it only has like 66 catches the last 2 years, somewhere around there. Now all of a sudden he might be your number 1 guy. So I wouldn't feel great about that. If you had Aaron Rodgers or Tom Brady or somebody as your quarterback, it wouldn't be the end of the world. You could get over it, and those guys have. But when you're talking about Blake Bortles, all of a sudden you're talking about those receivers, tight end-wise, Austin Severian Jenkins, who really wasn't particularly productive with the New York Jets, had like 50 catches, but had a real atrocious yards per catch average, something like 7.1. Ben Koyak, their blocking tight end, he was part of the final cuts. He might be somebody they re-sign. We'll see. And then Niles Paul, a guy who they're probably going to keep around for special teams purposes. So they don't have much there at tight end. It's kind of like the Houston situation last year, and possibly again this year, depending on what Jordan Akins does, where you don't feel really great about tight end production. Wide receiver production, you might just have a bunch of number 2 and 3 receivers, or you might have a couple of guys that might emerge as number 1 type receivers. You might have a guy like Chark and a guy like Westbrook, who could both be like number one type guys. But nonetheless, there's some concern there that maybe their receiving core isn't real deep, and that's going to be a big setback, especially in Bortles' development, especially his lack of consistency, to say the least. Again, good-looking offensive line. Cam Robinson really, really stepped up as a rookie. Tremendous left tackle. You've got Brandon Linder in there. You've got some other guys. So you've got a good-looking offensive line. But second half of the year, as Bortles continued to have his ups and downs, the offensive line got figured out a little bit as far as the running game goes, because Leonard Fournette, the 4th overall pick out of LSU last year, great start first half of his rookie year. And the second half of the year kind of disappeared because he didn't have a whole lot of room to run behind. The running game really started to go down in some of those later weeks to end the season. Then they were fine in the playoffs, but then, of course, in the AFC Championship game against the Patriots, they only had like 101 yards. It really kind of forced Bortles to play at a high level, because he knew that they were going to lose a game if he didn't, and they still ended up losing, but nonetheless played well. But Leonard Fournette, he's not a pass catcher. TJ Yeldon's constantly hurt, so that's kind of a backfield where if they have troubles running the ball, if they're stacking the box, if they kind of figure out Bortles, their offense could take a little bit of a step back this year. And if that happens, then yeah, the 9-7 prediction I have and missing the playoffs narrowly is definitely going to look pretty darn good. So Jacksonville, I just don't see Bortles taking that next step. I just, after believing him originally when he first came in the league, really haven't been a believer in him in a couple years. And I just can't really get behind Bortles. Can't really get behind the receiving core for now, even though I really like Chark a lot. D.D. Westbrook is a good-looking player. Cole's a good-looking player, but they're going to have to really step it up this year. Really no tight end play. Again, not a whole lot of promise in the backfield as far as pass catching, especially with Yeldon's injuries. And again, if they have issues running the ball second half of the year, that'll be a concern. And then again, you just have to wonder, is there any possible way that all these defensive players are going to start all 16 games again? I mean, most of these starters in defense were starting all 16. It just is like, I don't know. Again, the NFL law of averages, as I say, I just don't see that really happening again. We'll see. And then finally, that gets to last and least, is the Indianapolis Colts. 4-12 is my prediction for them. It's very, very tricky, and it's very, very difficult to really predict what the Indianapolis Colts are going to do this year, because all throughout the offseason, there were a lot of setbacks with Andrew Luck, and we really weren't sure if Andrew Luck was ever going to play a down of football ever again. He had that botched shoulder surgery. Then he had some setbacks. Had that really, really good-looking preseason game against the 49ers, dress rehearsal game. But guess what? They couldn't run the football. Offensive line still looked horrendous, even drafting Quentin Nelson, who I thought was the best player in the draft, 6th overall, who was a steal at 6. Still, they couldn't run the ball. They've got Anthony Costanzo, left tackle. They've got Nelson at left guard. Ryan Kelly coming back from injury, and he struggled when he did play last year. Has a chance to bounce back. Right side, though, Matt Slauson, right guard. He's getting up there in age now. He's, I believe, 32, former Chicago Bear and L.A. Charger. So, and then right tackle, Austin Howard, they signed him from the Ravens. Ravens wanted nothing to do with him, and I could see why. He was terrible in the preseason. He got cut. So you're going to have some issues on the right side of your line, it looks like, more than likely. Luck was getting killed in that preseason game against the Niners, even though he still played well. A couple times where he took off and run and put himself in position to get injured because he didn't slide in time. He got hit a couple times there, so he's going to have to work on that. That's been an issue from the past, including as well as fumbles. So you really don't feel like you have much of a running game right now. Marlon Mack has struggled in the preseason. Nyheim Hines has struggled in the preseason. They have another rookie in Jordan Wilkins out of Ole Miss, who's been the most impressive guy. But again, really no running lanes. Robert Turbin suspended for 4 games for performance-enhancing drug violation, that suspension. So running backs, you don't feel real great about them right now. But again, the reason you don't feel great about the running backs is because they've got no running room. I can't remember what the number was off the top of my head, but their rushing numbers were atrocious against the 49ers, and I believe Luck was actually leading the team in rushing at one point in that game. That's how bad it got. So you don't feel good about the line. It's more of the same, where Andrew Luck is going to be running for his life and getting sacked 40-plus times a year. Not going to have a running game once again, which has been an issue in the past for Indy with Andrew Luck. It's forced Andrew Luck to put the ball in the air 40-plus times a game. You still got good-looking receivers. You still got T.Y. Hilton. You still got Jack Doyle, and the big pickup this offseason, which a lot of people didn't think was going to be much of a pickup, and is looking pretty good in camp thus far is Eric Ebron, the former Detroit Lions first-round tight end. For the most part, he was a bust in Detroit. He had some pretty productive years, but he dropped too many passes, and Detroit couldn't stand by him. Well, guess what? Second half of last year, he actually started catching the ball really, really well, and he showed that he didn't have butterfingers anymore. But by then, Detroit had kind of made up their mind. They decided to move on from him. He's been tremendous in preseason. He caught a touchdown from Luck in that dress rehearsal a couple weeks ago against the Niners. So he's a guy that I think could really be an intriguing player in fantasy, just to kind of keep that in mind. And I wouldn't be surprised if he takes a lot of catches, a lot of targets away from Jack Doyle, who caught 80 passes last year, but he averaged less than 10 yards a catch. So again, didn't have a whole lot there at quarterback. Jacoby Brissett was playing. He's a decent player, but not really a full-on starter yet. So had some issues there because of the Luck injury, playing without Luck all year. But nonetheless, you've got Eric Ebron now. You've got Doyle in there. You've got T.Y. Hilton. So they've got pretty decent-looking receivers, even with the departure of Moncrief. But, Ryan Grant, he's a guy that wasn't really that great in Washington, was really kind of a third-type receiver for the Redskins. Originally signed a crazy big contract with the Ravens. I think it was like 4 years, $29 million, 4 years, $30 million, somewhere around there. In the offseason, he failed a physical, unfortunately for him, so he had to sign like a 1-year, $5 million deal with the Colts. But it's definitely the Colts' gain because he's been really, really good-looking in camp. He's been one of the more surprise players. It's brought some leadership as well, looking like a solid player. So Luck's going to feel good about his receivers, not that he didn't in the past, but he's going to feel good about them again. But the problem is, like I said, looks like they still don't have an offensive line, which means they still don't have a running game. When you have that exposes Luck to injury even more. So I made my 4-12 prediction before really knowing if Luck was going to be back for sure this year or not. And I'm going to still stick by the 4-12 because I don't know if I'm going to get Andrew Luck for all 16. I might only get Andrew Luck for 10 or 12 games, maybe less than that. And a thing you have to realize too is, and this isn't like a knock on Luck, but his last 2 years as a starter, the Colts have been 8-8 both years, in 15 and 16. The 1 year I believe he missed a game. But, 8-8 both years. So it's not like they were lighting it up the last couple years that he's actually played. They've had issues, and that's because their personnel has been bad. They've got a first-year head coach in Frank Reich, who obviously did a great job as offensive coordinator of the Eagles. He won with Nick Foles, backup quarterback, in the Super Bowl and throughout the playoffs. Wouldn't be shocked if Nick Foles is a week 1 starter in Indy in 2019, to be completely honest with you, because I just don't know about Andrew Luck's health. Andrew Luck is looking stronger and stronger each week throughout training camp, preseason. But again, if he gets killed by this offensive line constantly for the first, let's say, month, 6 weeks of the regular season, how many more games does he get to play beyond that? So that's why I feel like they're going to be a 4-12 football team, and especially the defense. They're switching to a 4-3 this year. That's something that Frank Reich, when he was offensive coordinator in Philadelphia, he saw how well the 4-3 worked. They're switching to a 4-3, and one of the guys who's been a real surprise in camp after having some struggles leading up to training camp trying to transition to the 4-3, John Simon, I've kind of mentioned him before. He was more of a hybrid rush linebacker elsewhere when he played in Houston, played in Baltimore in the past. So he had to be a hand-in-the-dirt 4-3 end, 6'1", 250, didn't really have the size. But yet he looked tremendous in preseason. The first preseason game, played just 9 snaps against the Seahawks, had 1.5 sacks. He actually, I believe, led the team in sacks this preseason, and yet shockingly, he didn't make the final cuts. He was actually cut in training camp. So a lot of people think maybe he'll go back to Houston, which if that happens, that'll be very, very nice for the Houston Texans because he's not really an ideal starter, more of a really good off the bench guy, kind of like that energy guy in the NBA that comes off the bench for you. But he can also start for substantial periods of time if you need him to. So I was really shocked by that John Simon cut because he was going to back up Jabal Sheard, and Jabal Sheard hasn't really been that productive the last couple of years. I think 10.5 combined sacks the last 2 years. But he was going to back him up, and he was going to provide a little bit of a pass rush off the bench because they had, I believe, only 25 sacks last year, and that was amongst the league's worst. I want to say it was next to last. I think it was just ahead of the Bucs, if I'm not mistaken. I'll have to go back and check that. But he would have been a big, big boost, and he would have done a little bit of everything as a jack of all trades. Obviously had some injuries last year, but played well when he was healthy. So I was really surprised by that move because the other the young guys, the other defensive ends behind those two, they haven't really done hardly anything in preseason. They haven't been productive. Remember, they took a kid out of Rutgers in the second round, Kamoko Toure, edge rusher from Rutgers, who is a guy that had a lot of inconsistency while he was at Rutgers. And so because of that inconsistency, stock fell a little bit in the draft. Again, hasn't done a whole lot in preseason. Terrell Basham, the former Ohio University product, he was taken in 2017. He's another guy who really hasn't done a whole lot. So you don't feel real great about your pass rush. You don't really have anybody. And again, being a 4-3 team, you're talking about hand-in-the-ground guys. So your defensive linemen are the ones that are going to be getting after the quarterback, and you look at it and you don't really feel that great about it right now. So, you look at it, you've got Al Woods as your nose tackle. I don't know. Overall, not feeling real great about this defensive line right now. I don't feel like it's going to be that much better against the run than it was last year. Don't feel like their sack totals are going to be much better than they were last year. So there's some issues there. Linebacker-wise, they were dealing with some injuries. Anthony Walker, projected starter as a middle linebacker, he gets banged up in training camp and unavailable. So what happens? Sky Moore, who was super productive at South Carolina, he takes over, and he's now projected week 1 starter. So good for him. But again, linebacking core, it's a little bit thin. Got some injuries there, trying to figure out who's going to be available week 1, who isn't. Secondary-wise, a really, really big fan of Malik Hooker coming out of Ohio State, which, again, I hate to say that because I'm not an Ohio State fan, but Malik Hooker, great player coming out of Ohio State. But remember, he had a number of injuries leading up to the draft in 2017, and that's why he fell to the middle of the first round. Then he gets banged up and barely plays in preseason in 2017, and then he goes down partway into the 2017 season after having like 3 interceptions. So he was really a playmaker very, very early on, and he was on his way to probably an all-pro type selection. But what ended up happening is he goes down, he tears his ACL, and so now there's uncertainty. Is he going to constantly deal with injuries? Is that going to change him? I mean, is he going to not be the same player? Is he going to lose a couple steps? How is he going to recover from yet another major injury? So his body's really falling apart at a young age. And that's really, really concerning because they don't have a real deep secondary. Remember, they got rid of Vontae Davis, who's now with the Buffalo Bills. So he wasn't real productive as a starting corner last year, but he's gone. Darius Butler, their former corner safety, he's gone. So they've gotten a lot younger in their secondary, and I don't know. That it's fine that they've gotten younger, but the guys that are back there, are either hurt or they're not very consistent. Linebacking core is very thin. They don't have much of a pass rush. So overall, not feeling that great about the Indianapolis Colts. And so that's why I give them 4-12. I think 8-8 is probably their ceiling. If Luck has an amazing year and if they kind of get their act together offensively, 8-8 could be a possibility, but I still think the defense will continue to hold them back like it has for many, many years. So I don't feel great about defense at all. And again, still doesn't have the running game and offensive line. I don't want to beat a dead horse, beat a dead colt by saying that, but it's just one of those things that these are the same issues. And again, new head coach, so you got to give him a chance, Frank Reich. Just a second-year GM and Chris Ballard, who's been making some moves, but they still got a ways to go. So again, it's just a team that you look at and you just don't feel particularly great about them. It feels like they're having the same problems over and over and over again, like they've had for years and years and years. And you just have to ask yourself, when is it finally going to change? When are they going to finally have that big-time defense? When are they going to finally have a really good running game and a really good solid offensive line where Luck's not constantly getting hit, where he doesn't have to throw it 40 times a game every single week? So until that happens, I don't feel great about the Colts, and I'm going to stick by my 4-12 prediction. Maybe they'll do a little bit better than that. Maybe they'll make a run as a dark horse in a division. But I feel really good about the top 3 teams. I just think the Titans are a little bit better, a little bit more complete than the Texans, much better offensive line. Jacksonville, because of the receiver situation and especially the Blake Bortles situation, until Blake Bortles shows me a heck of a lot more, and until some of these younger receivers, who I do think are pretty darn good, until those guys can really step it up for an entire season and show what they've got, it's hard to really get behind Jacksonville too much. So Jacksonville, again, 9-7, Indy 4-12. Houston will sneak in the playoffs 9-7. Tennessee will find a way to take the division with the revolutionary offensive coordinator that is Matt LaFleur, and they'll finish 10-6 and win the division. We'll see what happens in postseason. Like I said, I'm going to have a postseason playoff predictions here very, very soon, so look for that. But at any rate, that's all I've got. So make sure you go to the sugarhuddle.com and check out all the articles and A lot of good stuff on there. And then, of course, subscribe to my YouTube channel. So thanks a lot. Take care.